Let's get an explanation about this from David Kay. He was the chief U.S. weapons inspector in Iraq. He's a member of the State Department's International Security Advisory Board. David, we are thrilled to have you here to clear up what I think is a big question that everyone has when they first hear this story. You know, we didn't think Iraq had WMDs. What are these?
Well, John, the history of this facility is interesting. First of all, you have to understand how large it is. It's larger than the District of Columbia in terms of total area. It was extensively bombed by the U.S. in the first Gulf War. When we went in 1991, and that was the UN inspection team, UNSCOM at that point, the facility buildings were collapsed, bunkers were torn open from bombs. It was a huge mess. Now, what the UN did is it gathered all the chemical arms it could safely and incinerated them, got rid of them. There were a small number, I certainly wouldn't call a stockpile, a small number of weapons that were essentially too dangerous because they were leaking for the inspectors to even drain them and incinerate them. They were put into two very large bunkers and sealed in concrete. Now, when I went back in 2003 and went out to this facility, I discovered that indeed in the period after the UN inspectors left in 1998, and before the second Gulf War in 2003, the Iraqis or someone had broken into some of the bunkers and gone through various facilities. Now, what they gathered together is a lot of scrap that was contaminated. It was more toxic than chemical weapons. The Iraqi chemical weapons, most of them did not survive as stable chemical weapons in the environment for very long. There certainly are chemical weapons and leakers there still, but they're much more dangerous to anyone who tries to get them than they are to anyone they could possibly be used on. The insurgents in 2004, 2005 tried to use a couple of these weapons as improvised roadside bombs, and indeed they killed no one, did no damage at all. So I actually hope ISIS tries to dig through the facility and get access to them. They'll end up killing, probably more effective than anything else, ISIS fighters.
So they're more of a threat to ISIS than they are to anyone else. That interesting. Also interesting, though, you know, the U.S. knew these things were there. So the question is, why are they still there? I want to play something that then Secretary of State Colin Powell said in 2004. Listen to this.
Not a figment of our imagination. He had chemical weapons. And not 20 years ago, he had them at the time of the first Gulf War. Didn't use them. We found those stocks and destroyed them.
So he says we destroyed them, but it falls outside that group clearly, you think. The U.S. intentionally didn't destroy these just because it was too dangerous to get near them? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it was the UN's job at that point, not the U.S. military. And the UN inspectors destroyed everything that could be safely destroyed. And the technical advice was some of these are simply too dangerous to handle. They're leaking. Saddam had two things he did that were just still to this day amazing to me. One, he didn't mark which weapons were chemical and which were high explosives. This is why some in the U.S. military in 1991 were exposed when they tried to get rid of what they thought were high explosive. The other thing he did is he mixed chemical agents in a way that no one has ever done. You found sarin mixed with mustard, mixed with tear gas. And some of these things were simply too dangerous, and they were sealed. It's a relatively small number. And like I say, mostly today, given the time and the heat in Iraq, they've disappeared. Now, the Iraqi government, the inspectors left in 98, in 2000, the U.S. left in 2011. There have been no eyes on this facility, as far as I know, since 2011. And I think that's largely because everyone looked at the technical judgments made and said, it's a dangerous, toxic waste dump. It is not weapons storage.
So just quickly, yes or no, there's nothing the U.S. should be doing about this now?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not with current intelligence. I can imagine some things you might do. Cluster munitions, for example, that would discourage even more ISIS soldiers from going around. But basically, I'm not worried about this. There are other things. You have to realize ISIS seized a large amount of current U.S. military equipment that we had given to the Iraqi military when they abandoned Mosul and fled towards Baghdad. So they actually have some very good weapons in their hands now. And the chemical weapons are really not military weapons.